Cameras live in 3, 2, 1.
Good evening and a very warm welcome. My name is Isabel Hilton. I'm a journalist and I'm the founder of China Dialogue, which is a bilingual Chinese-English website that covers all aspects of climate change with a particular reference to China, the world's biggest emitter. And I'm really delighted to be here and to be your host for this forecast session, which is organized by Invisible Dust, where artists and scientists meet for projects focused on climate change and the environment. And tonight, we're asking the question, who chooses our future and how? When Greta Thunberg, then 15 years old, emerged into global prominence, her message was simple. Political leaders had failed to act on the climate emergency. So now, as she put it, it was up to the children like her. And it was an extremely powerful message that mobilized young people all around the world. And it precipitated Greta herself into the speaker slot at numerous high-level meetings. And it pointed very directly to the failures of those who were effectively choosing a terrible future for her generation. And her message that the failure meant that young people could no longer look to the future with confidence remains essentially true. Despite the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, emissions continue to rise and the scientific reports become more and more stark. Now, it's not that nothing has happened. A lot of changes are underway, but they're not enough and they're not happening fast enough. And there's a fundamental unfairness at the heart of this. The least developed countries, the world's poorest people, and young people have contributed least to climate change, and they have the least power in the decision-making process. And yes, they're likely to suffer most. So what's wrong here? When those most effective have the least say, and what can we do about it? So who should be making the decisions about the future, and how should those decisions be made? So that's what we're going to be talking about with a great panel that I am about to introduce. But before I introduce them, I'd like to encourage you to answer a question that will be put to you in the Zoom poll. It'll come up on your screen, and when you see it, please click on it and answer, and we will get a sense of how you feel about the issue. There's the question. Just click on it. Yes, no, unsure. It'll be around for much of the discussion, but I would encourage you to vote early and vote often, as they say in Ireland. Sorry, Ireland. Now, to the discussion, let me introduce Cornelia Parker, visual artist, best known for her sculpture and dramatic installation art, and for being the first ever female election artist at the last British election. Rose Mutiso is an energy expert from East Africa, and she's the CEO and co-founder of the Mawazo Institute, which supports the next generation of female thought leaders in East Africa. And Rose has some surprising things to tell us about the energy mix in Kenya, for example. Jonathon Porritt is the founder director of the Forum for the Future and someone who's tried to change things for longer than most of us have been aware how much they needed changing. He's the author of Hope in Hell, a book that examines the realities and the solutions for the climate emergency. And Daisy Gaji, climate justice activist and student of history and politics at Goldsmiths, who stood as an MEP. And part of her pitch was that her unsuitability for the job was her strong point. She was an ordinary person, not a professional politician, and that is why she should be elected. Now, we have 1 hour to fix the planet's future. What could possibly go wrong? And we're going to hear from our panelists, then we shall have a discussion, and then we very much want to hear from you with your questions to the panelists. So please be ready, put questions in the Q&A or in the chat box, and we shall get to as many as we can. So I'm pretty sure we all have reservations about how decisions that will so seriously affect the future are currently made. So we're going to see if we can arrive at a better solution. And we're going to begin with asking our panelists to answer the same question so we can hear from them. And the question is, who should be making these decisions and how should they be making them? And I'm going to begin by asking Cornelia to answer that question.
I think the Pope should be at least on the panel.
Well, he was busy tonight, Cornelia. I'm really sorry.
He's incredible, I think. Also, there's this man, this wonderful scientist I met called John Schellenhuber, who runs the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change, or perhaps he's emeritus professor there now. But when I went to this two-day event at Oxford University about 12 years ago called Changing the Climate, and it was climate scientists reaching out to artists and writers and dancers, and they said they weren't getting their message across, so therefore we possibly could, because we talk about human, the whole range of emotions that we are dealing with. What was amazing about that two-day event, it changed my life completely, because I kind of realized for the first time how dire everything was. And John Schellenhuber, his idea was to have a kind of Manhattan Project, almost like a group of Nobel scientists, as a very respected group who weren't tied to any particular country, and that they, the Manhattan Project was, that was about building the atom bomb before Hitler did. So that happened all very quickly. At the moment, we've got COVID, and we've got vaccines. We've got loads of vaccines, which are supposed to take years, that have appeared very quickly. So things can be done very quickly. I just think the level of emergency is not there, and all the different politicians in different countries have all got their electorate, and they're all kind of can't, they have one arm tied behind their back, they can't do what's needed. Biden, Joe Biden's great because he's at least throwing everything at it the moment, I think, which is brilliant. I keep hoping he doesn't drop dead. And that Trump does instead. Because I think if Trump got in again in 4 years' time, we're stuffed, it really does depend on political will. Too much, I think, but it really does depend on political will. And the idea of a group of scientists, being in control, I like much better. And engineers, and I don't know, it just needs... a thing Gordon Brown said, which I really liked, was he suggested a Tobin tax, which is a tax on all the exchanges, currency exchanges all over the world. And that Tobin tax would be used to pay, to pay all the expenses of climate change, for retooling Britain. And he actually put, he got Nicholas Stern to do an audit, a financial audit, to show how much we're losing by not doing anything about climate change. So those kind of things are really useful, I think. But the Tobin tax and the Manhattan Project, I think, and the Pope, I think, good team.
That's like a winning combination.
Sorry, that's my penny's worth.
Days, Cornelia seems not to rate politicians terribly highly. Would rather have engineers, scientists, and the Pope making the decisions. When you're a young person, you're a student, but you, when you engaged in politics, did it by trying to join a system, a political system, standing for election. So who do you think should be making the decisions?
Yeah,
you want to be a politician, you think maybe politicians.
I think it's changing who politicians are is my main thing. And I don't just focus on that like institutional change. It has to come, pressure has to be on the outside as well, because that's how you get things done, is they can feel the pressure of something changing internally, but also feeling the external pressure as well. A lot of my work has been around getting young people involved in politics and understanding their stake within society and democracy, and making sure democracy actually runs how a democracy is meant to. And I think that's really important. But also it has been on the ground with groups like Extinction Rebellion, shouting from the outside, demanding more, because as it was said before, there does need to be public appetite for change. And I don't think that when you start talking about climate change and making people understand what is the cost of climate change, I think it's pretty obvious what most people will do. Most people would want to save their own existence and save the world that we love and we care about. And especially in England, we always talk about how beautiful our English greens are, but we fail to protect them. So I think it's very much getting people to understand. And I feel that when I think about who should create the decisions, I think youth should be very much at the heart and at the front of it, as it's our future and we need to find agency around it. But I don't think it should be just youth. I think it should be co-created by everyone, and especially the people who've been the most unheard in society. We need to stop making policies that have so many blind spots just by including people in the decision making. And I do think that it really does need to come down to that true essence of democracy and the beauty in democracy. I'm quite controversially going to say, like, what we live in now is a very warped democracy, of where it's the politicians that tell us what they are going to do rather than us telling them what we need to be done. And I think that needs to change. I feel like the government should be of service to the public and the society. And that's something that through my running for election, I wanted to bring some awareness to. And I think when it comes to governments, they should be acting from a place of love and care and duty for the earth, but also for people, for animals, for all living things. And that's something that isn't so often done, as we've seen in this pandemic, of where we've had some of the highest death tolls in the world, and our government, all they can say is sorry, rather than stop being incompetent and start working with scientists and co-creating ways of us getting through this pandemic and this challenge together. And I feel like with COVID being an issue that's quite similar to the climate crisis, and the need for urgency and the need to save lives, and they have shown what they're able to do, which is improper, and they need to give the power back to the people. And I think that kind of goes to who I think should be making the decisions. It should be society as a whole coming together to formulate decisions. Do I know how that's going to be done, or what's the best way to facilitate that? No, but that's the whole point of us coming together, because someone will, and people will have ideas of how to do this. I've grown up with the idea of thinking about citizens' assemblies and how we can use peoples and citizens' assemblies to bring people together to, one, understand the science, feel emotionally about what's happening, and learn how to connect to the environment and people and social justice issues in a really strong way, and then make decisions from a knowledgeable point of view. And I think that's what we need to be doing.
And so if I could maybe just try to sum that up a bit, it would be that, yes, through a democratic system, but a much better democratic system, which in which citizens had more of voice in feeding ideas and greater diversity of voices. Would that be a fair summary of?
Yeah, I think in a real democracy,
a real democracy,
people power is literally what it is.
Right. Rose, you've talked about the underrepresentation, looking at the global discussion of climate change, and it's nothing if not a global discussion and a global challenge. The underrepresentation of, again, the most affected. You know, we've talked about Africa's energy needs. We've talked about the poorest with the least agency and the least power, who will be affected most. So how, the question to you, with the same question, how should we be making the decisions, since clearly they're not working at the moment for the people you often speak for? And so how can we change that for the better?
Yeah, such a big question. And I mean, the urgency of the problem, the scale of the problem, sometimes it makes me wish that we had some kind of, super command control system, maybe the Pope, some central person that makes a decision, or, whichever, super intelligent beings or computers are running the simulation that we live in. I wish somebody could just make the decision from the top down. But, obviously we've seen all the ways in which that, doesn't work out well. And particularly in terms of representing the views of marginalized groups, which is a very large group of people when it comes to climate change, marginalized people who are going to be very much disproportionately affected. So obviously we have some mechanisms, both at the kind of local, national, global level to make decisions and cooperate somehow. As Days has said, and Cornelia did also, these are kind of increasingly getting log jammed. There's no political will, you know, things are working backwards, or the interests of the people are not being represented. Still, you know, we don't have a lot of time to get our, you know, to get a handle on climate change. And so to some extent, we can't throw away the tools that we have. And we need to figure out how to make them work. And so, you know, I think that we have kind of two levels that we need to work at. You know, one is this kind of big structural decision making that needs to be, so that we can have change at the scale needed, at the pace needed. And so I think the kind of main levers at this big structural level are, I think, one, technology. You know, technology is just one of those shortcuts that can help us, you know, to some extent have our cake and eat it. You know, if somebody could just make, you know, fusion energy work today, or I don't know, capture, I don't know, reflect mirrors into the sun and make temperatures, whatever it is. If there's some kind of technological silver bullet, that would be great. Obviously, that's not how it works, but technology is helping us. It, you know, is buying us a lot of progress very fast, increasingly. And so I think we need to have scientists really empowered to do more, and innovators to kind of push that technology lever. Related to that, I think industry is the other kind of massive player, massive decision maker that, you know, is really, how do I say it, like pace setting. You know, when the incentives are right, when the profits align, industry, you know, goes with the flow. I mean, we're already seeing so many companies making massive pledges. You know, all the car companies now have, like, you know, full electric vehicle fleet pledges. You know, companies such as BP have, you know, zero carbon pledges in ways that, you know, TBD, we're not sure how they do it. But anyway, clearly industry is kind of seeing the signals and starting to move. And, you know, when industry moves, that will have a massive, you know, tectonic impact on everything. And then the last one is obviously government. And, you know, government really does impact where technology goes, where industry goes, using incentives, regulations, and you name it. Obviously, in all of this, we don't want to lose the agency and the voice of the individuals. Like they said, individuals have to, decisions have to be driven by the will of the people somehow. We know that when individuals, when organized and coordinated, they can play a big role in influencing what the big players do, what government does, what corporations do. And we really need to kind of sharpen those. We need to kind of weaponize that more, and maybe kind of some of the stuff that Days is talking about is one way that we can get at that. People are also motivated by local action and impact. And so we need to somehow make this big climate conversation relevant to everyday people's lives and their communities and what's happening right around them. Of course, governments and companies and all of that are themselves made of people and individuals. And so we need to have as many perspectives. We just need a very inclusive spaces across these sectors: technology, industry, government. You know, for me, obviously, I really, you know, I come from a scientific background, and I come from this kind of international climate diplomacy world, representing with one hat kind of women in science, on the other hat kind of where Africans, who's speaking for Africans, who's speaking for these regions that have really been, you know, screwed over, to be honest, and are dealing with the impacts of climate in a world in which they don't have you know, a big decision-making role. The big players are kind of sitting at the table, and Africans and other small nations are kind of on the sides. And so, sure. You know,
although realistically, it's the big players that have to change their behavior. So in a sense, that's who we need at the table.
Exactly. And I think this is, well, so this is the thing. The big players, though, are, without really understanding, first, the small players really need to advocate their position and make the big players really see what's happening. And why their action is important. So right now, for example, one of the things that my colleagues and I talk about at the Energy for Growth Hub, which is a think tank I'm affiliated with, is the European Union, the United Kingdom, rich countries are really anxious to demonstrate action on climate right now. And so because the political situation is not always amenable locally or domestically, their foreign stance is where they try to really kind of show that they're serious about climate change. And so let's not try to dictate what kind of energy sector development happens in poor countries, really trying to have a very harsh stance on climate with regards to their foreign investments and foreign aid. But that's kind of backwards. We're trying to penalize or trying to put the focus on the small emitting countries. That's not the issue. The issue is reflecting backwards on your role. And so somehow when it's just the big players at the table, some of that is lost, where they don't really kind of make the connections that are needed and are not really held accountable in the ways that they should be.
Understood. And I'd like to come back to that actually, but first I'd like to hear from Jonathon. Jonathon, you've worked closely with governments. You've been probably more involved in the kind of sausage machine than any of us. There is a sense that it's not working for a lot of people. Who should make the decisions, and how should they be made?
Yeah, it's certainly not working. That's absolutely right. And that was one of the reasons why Extinction Rebellion back in 2019, one of their demands was that a citizens' assembly should be set up, and that it would be the citizens' assembly which would decide what should happen. So the recommendation was it would simply bypass parliament and bypass the political system altogether. And for those of us who struggle with the failings of democracy, as Day said, but nonetheless subscribe to the belief that ultimately our prospects depend on fully functioning democracies. However supportive I was about what Extinction Rebellion was suggesting at that time, I could not go along with the idea that there will be a group of people outside of a political process who will make these decisions for us, even if they were much more representative of society at large. So I'm afraid, rather predictably, I'm going to come back to the fact that democracy is the least worst system that we have. It is open to change, that is for sure. We don't perhaps see as much change in democracies as we'd like to. And I'm absolutely certain we'll all understand that democracy is at risk. The Democracy Index, which is the annual survey published by the Economist Intelligence Unit, said there are no more than 430 million people in the world today who live in fully functioning democracies. That's 430 million out of 7.8 billion. All the rest are living in political systems of varying kinds, but not fully functioning democracies. And you might well ask whether we live in a fully functioning democracy in the UK or America, both of which are still included in fully functioning democracies, but it makes you think sometimes when you look at it. So for me, the thing that I would say, we've got to make sure that our democracies thrive. And the best way of enabling democracies to thrive is to ensure that more people have access to those democratic systems and can participate fully in them and influence them and change them and radicalize them and all the rest of it. So that's critical. And I hate to be critical in my final comment, but I think a lot of climate campaigners are very complacent about the state of democracy in the world today. They don't believe it's a necessary component in their climate campaigning. But I'm going to ask a little question. There are two new bills that have come into Congress in the last 36 hours. The first is about Biden and Kamala Harris's huge new climate action plan, which is a brilliant thing. And it's really a great tonic to the world to see what a fully fledged climate action plan would look like. The second is what's called HR 1, which is all about the future of democracy in the USA. And it's all about essentially going after the attempts by Republicans to suppress voters, to keep democracy alive in America, because democracy in America now is under attack as never before. Which of those two bills is more important from a climate point of view? America's new climate action plan, or a bill to make sure that America's democracy is protected? Well, I know which way I would. If I was only allowed to have one bill and the other one had to fall and disappear, I would be supporting HR 1, the democracy bill.
Yeah.
Because everything else depends on that.
Well, for a man who's campaigned for climate change for so many years, that's quite remarkable. It's also perhaps worth noting that although nobody is doing enough on climate, countries that are perhaps making more progress tend to be democracies, and that is, inadequate, but nevertheless the case. So autocracy doesn't necessarily lead to more decisive or effective action on climate change, or indeed the protection of minority groups. They don't tend to thrive in autocracies any more than, and rather less than in democracies, I would say. But I think there is, if I could just pick up on this issue and the defense of democracy that we've heard from at least two panelists, there is nevertheless a kind of, climate change is a wicked problem for democracies which tend to think in electoral cycles, and politicians have to answer to the voters every electoral cycle. That can be 4 or 5 years. In the case of the House of Representatives, 2 years. I can't think how they cope. And the fact is that decisions taken now will have their effects on climate in 10, 15, 20 years. No politician in office now is going to be in office in 2050 or 2060, and nor are the advisors and the bureaucrats who support them. So how do we get that that urgency into decision making in a democratic system for effects which won't be manifest fully until long after the politician has left office?
I think that a few years ago, Anthony Gormley, Lord Stern, and Mike Perry, we went to see George Osborne to propose a kind of green revolution, very naively. And I've been and I've been working with a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Kostya Novoselov, up in Manchester University, and he discovered graphene with Andre Geim. Graphene, I think, has a potential to solve lots of, the climate change problems. It's in terms of being a superconductor, and it has lots of properties. I think nanotechnology could be the way. I mean, we just don't, things have, but what annoyed me so much is that they were not, the Tory government weren't investing in graphene up in Manchester. They were getting, the Chinese president over to have a look and show him the wonderful graphene, but they were kind of almost like they felt like they were performing trick dogs or whatever. So graphene has been successful in all kinds of ways all over the world, mostly in batteries, which I think is the best possible use for graphene. Is it could make batteries that would charge up in seconds, in minutes, rather than hours and hours. So it could just, and it doesn't take much. It's very small. So I think there's all kinds of things. But George Osborne, as a kind of chancellor, he wasn't investing in the very asset that had been discovered on our shore. And now, Kostya's gone off to live in Singapore and work there. It's like a brain drain.
Right. So that is a good example, and I think that I don't know what you think about this, Rose, but it's not my impression that a shortage of technological solutions is our problem. The problem is, what gets invested in and what gets pushed, and what regulatory system governs the access and the development of a market for technological solutions. So that question of how do you change the priorities of politicians who are already in office or will be elected in 5 years' time, with an eye on a future in 20 or 30 years' time? How do you do that? Rose, do you have a?
Yeah, sure. I'll just say I'm a materials. I have a materials background, so I love talk of graphene anytime. I'm here for it. But anyway, yes, it's a really tough one because your to your original point, Isabel, about how do you have people who won't be around over the next 5 decades to kind of make decisions with that in mind. But we have so many examples in the past. Think of FDR and the New Deal. I don't know very much about British political history, but I imagine the post-war reforms that were made. I think that there are a lot of examples of times when governments and politicians have had such vision. I don't know, the I guess Manhattan Project that Cornelia mentioned, or the space race, JFK, all of that. Like, it is possible, and I see some of that even now in, as you said, in Biden's proposals and the new kind of momentum, and even in the U.S. among the Democratic Party and other left allies, to try and kind of bring back that vision and that forward-looking momentum. So I think it is possible. It's not impossible for people to think that way. Something has happened, something is broken. You know, in the short term, while we don't have maybe necessarily the same people of vision and ambition in power, then it's back to what Days was saying, is like kind of put pressure on them. You know, young people over and over again don't show up, don't vote, don't have, you know, are apathetic. You know, they're the ones who are going to live in the post 2050 world. They need to show up, they need to put the pressure, they need to vote out the people who are not acting in their best interest. So I think that we just need the pressure from the people so that we can have the right decision makers who are taking the long view. Final, yeah, sorry, go ahead, John.
No, sorry, I just wanted to back you up on that, Rose, because I think it's really important to remind ourselves that this stuff does matter. When young people get active and put pressure on the political system, it makes a difference. In 2019, the school strikes, the young climate activist organizations that came to the fore in 2019 all around the world, but particularly very influentially in the UK. Within 6 months of that and Extinction Rebellion, the UK became the first industrial country in the world to declare a net zero carbon commitment by 2050. Theresa May, our Prime Minister, would not have done that without there being that expression of anger and concern and passion from young people. In the elections for the Senate in Georgia back in January, the role of young people in getting young voters to register and getting them out on the day was probably the single most important factor in winning those 2 senatorial seats in Georgia, which is the only thing that is going to make it possible for the Biden-Harris administration to do what they want to do around climate change. So I'm completely with this notion that it's still possible to bring that pressure from young people in particular to bear on political systems, to change things in a way that sometimes will look, it could be much more ambitious than actually we give credit for.
Gaze, do you agree? How do we make sure that young people don't just sit around complaining and do get out and vote?
Well, obviously I'm biased. I think
you're clearly a shining example, but
but I think we do, our generation does get like a bit of stick about being lazy or pathetic. I don't think it is. It's that we're really tired. We're tired that we have to you know, like I'm 20, I should be living it up somewhere in Kavos or Ibiza or something and partying through summer. But what am I doing? I'm here trying to tell people to care about the climate, and something that I feel like a lot of young people see as just a part of being and a part of living on this earth is to care for people and the planet around us. So I do think that it isn't from like a point of just being lazy, but it's a point of being frustrated. And I do think that we need to, like, you know, shake off a bit of the frustration and power ahead, because we have such strength. And as Rose was saying, I think there is something really beautiful about vision, and I think that's what young people bring to it too. We bring like this really wide idea of what our world should be and what we should have and what we should accept as well. And I think even when John was saying, which bill would you rather? Why do we have to pick? Why do we have both? Why shouldn't we have both? Because we should. So I think that it really should depend on getting young people, but also so like learning from what's already out there. You know, there is already technology. There are already amazing like communities of indigenous people who've been protectors of the land since forever. Why aren't we learning? And I do think when people start to take more of a motive feel to what climate change is, because climate change isn't just something that happens in the 0.5 degrees or whatever degrees we're calling today. It's something that's very emotive. It's our connection to our land, our surroundings, our world, our existence. And I think when people start seeing it that way, there is no way that a government will tell us, so sorry, love, we can't do that, because we would say, no, we can and we have to. So I do think this is where it's very much about putting pressures on governments and also becoming governments. I think that's a really large part of it, getting young people engaged in politics to run for politics and not just having the same elite private schools who are the ones who are churning out politicians, but having a politician who grew up in a council estate who can help on social housing, having a politician who had lived experiences of poverty and climate change to be able to counsel on that. I think that's what we need to do. We need a real diversifying of our institutions, and we need better systems of accountability. And also we need to know about our institutions as well. There are so many people who are young and they don't know how the political system works. They don't know how to register to vote. They don't know. And how do we expect anything of them when they haven't been taught? You know, I know my own understanding of politics has been very much something that I've had to opt into rather than just being told. And we go through that laborious, you know, school system to end up not knowing anything about how the world works. And I think that needs to change.
I mean, we do live in a world where it's never been easier to find things out. So, you know, again, there is a kind of question of will and attention, perhaps.
But who has the power and who feels like they have agency within the issue? I know my agency stemmed from being in groups like Extinction Rebellion, who told me my voices deserve to be heard. But as a young person, you're constantly told you don't know enough, or people like you don't make it this far. And when you have that as your constant, we don't know enough, we're young, you kind of just take that. But I think it is that mind change that we need as well.
So I want to pick up on clearly Extinction Rebellion, as we all agree, had a massive impact, and it did change politics. You know, it made decisions more imperative. So I want to come back, I guess, to the question of crisis, foresight, and the moment we're in. We've all been locked down for a year. Extinction Rebellion is no longer on the streets. We can't have big demonstrations. We can't have that kind of mobilization that young people, you know, did so extraordinarily effectively in 2018 and 2019. And we're coming up to COP26 when actually we need that pressure. So on the other hand, Rose was referencing moments when big decisions and far-sighted vision did come into politics, things like FDR and the New Deal. What I would say about that was they came off the back of an evident crisis. And going back to the question of climate change being a wicked problem, the worst crisis of climate change is still in the future. But if we don't act now, it will happen. On the other hand, we are in a crisis now because of COVID. So I'm interested to know if you think that the COVID moment, what COVID has done to the way we live, to our economics, to our assumptions about life, has maybe created an opportunity that is a climate-shaped opportunity here. Is this something that can come out of this? Jonathon, you're an old hand at how decisions work. You know, if a system breaks for whatever reason, surely it's a chance to create a different system, a green recovery rather than a business as usual recovery.
Theoretically, yep.
That sounded a little wary there.
Well, I don't want to be the bearer of too much bad news, but if you actually look at what governments around the world have done over the 12 months of the pandemic, 2/3 of the support that they have given their economies has gone to support yesterday's economy, the old world economy, the carbon intensive, life crushing economy. And 1/3 has gone to build better prospects for tomorrow, for young people, for disadvantaged communities, etc. So even now, in the midst of the worst public health crisis for 100 years, we've still got governments essentially looking more to the past than looking to the future, which is utterly extraordinary and utterly reprehensible, which is why, again, we have to come back to this story about how much pressure can be brought to bear on the politicians to do these things differently. Signals that is changing. So just to be absolutely clear, in many EU countries now, there are all sorts of indications that civil society is speaking much more powerfully to politicians and saying, this is not acceptable. You may have got into positions of power because of your relationship with the power brokers of yesterday, but you're not going to stay in power unless you start to think about power for tomorrow.
I just actually, jumping off of that point, I do agree that somehow, kind of perversely, COVID, we're kind of almost backtracking because, you know, governments are seeing, are under a lot of pressure over economic recovery. And so the kind of the lofty goals that might lead to some short-term economic, like the hard decisions that might lead to some short-term economic gain, long-term economic pain, short-term economic pain, but long-term gain across many dimensions, including climate. Those decisions are harder and harder to make. And even in China, we're seeing a little bit more of a regression despite the ambitious goals, just to kind of get economies moving again. And so I think that ties back to a point that I alluded to at the very beginning, that the economics, corporations, business, industry, the financial incentives, that is so important. And it's something that a lot of people really don't appreciate. People in technology and science, which is kind of an area I'm from, or activists that really that follow the money. That's how decisions are made. And right now, governments are really, really sensitive to that. Of course, we can completely remake that. Like we're learning just now in economics that a lot of conventional wisdom about what we thought was prudent is changing, like deficit spending. This is so much is changing in that space that maybe we have more wiggle room that we thought than we did, but still governments are acting really, really conservatively, and businesses are putting a lot of pressure on government. And I think business and corporations have the most influence, more than the young people on the streets by far. Like business kind of sets the pace.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a friend, Mariana Mazzucato, who's an economist, and she wrote this book called The Entrepreneurial State, and she's American-Italian, and it's mostly about America, but it's about how people like Elon Musk and the Apple, and a lot of the great strides that America's made in technology, that came from government money. It was a subsidy. And so, but nobody knows that somehow. And so Musk is, doing electric cars and, sort of solar panels for roofs, all this stuff. It's kind of, it's doing some good for humanity. But that entrepreneurial state thing fell down, I think, when in America, because of Trump cut all those kind of subsidies, leaving a big hole, really, I think, in which I hope is being filled by Biden. But yeah.
Cornelia, I mean, just coming back to what both you and Rose have been saying, the technology pipeline, the innovation pipeline is overflowing with solutions to all of the problems we face. Really not, this is absolutely not the problem. These are not the barriers. There's no problem about money. There's no problem about technology. If we really could make this work, get those technologies deployed with the backing that they need, then the solutions would come thick and fast. And actually, I think that's really important, because people need to know that dealing with the climate emergency, and I saw a question in the chat box a minute ago, what's the language we use? I always talk about the climate emergency. I don't talk about climate change. You've got to get people into an emergency mindset. But if people see that addressing the climate emergency means jobs, opportunity, access to things that haven't happened before, new skills, all of that stuff, if they see, oh, okay, well, this is one hell of a challenge we've got, but actually addressing it will deliver a lot of things that we want in our communities for the people who at the moment are not benefiting from our current economy, then there is a bit of a win-win emerging in that sense. And I can see that definitely much more visible in people's lives, much more.
No, I think, I mean, because what needs to happen is we need to retool the world, remake it, and it'll be very good for jobs and money and all the rest of it. I don't understand why governments don't understand that. It's just.
You had a meeting with George Osborne. You obviously got your answer there.
Well, yeah, not very. I just said, you're sitting on a gold mine here. I said, why aren't you exploiting it?
Well, indeed. I mean, actually, it's one of the differences, I think, between the Chinese government's approach and Trump's approach. Yeah. The Chinese government saw the opportunity side of climate change in the new technology, in the low carbon investment, and that's taken a while to take hold as an idea.
I'm surprised it's taken so long. I mean, I thought, the dictator, the benevolent dictator, I mean, it's not benevolent anymore, obviously, but, can make things happen very quickly. They could say, oh, only have one child, I mean, that's.
I think that's, yes. that's another discussion.
That's
No,
another discussion.
I'm not saying that's a good
Bring
thing.
in some of our audience. Actually.
But you know, China's ability to be able to move things very quickly.
It can be exaggerated, Cornelia. Trust me.
Oh yeah, of course, you're an expert. I'm talking to the wrong
He doesn't always get what he wants.
Oh, yes.
So some questions have been coming in from our attentive audience, and they do look at this question of moving politicians. So we have an anonymous one. How do we deal with politicians and governments that refuse to acknowledge and act on the evidence that is presented to them?
The big question.
What do we? Do you have an answer? Do you have a solution here?
Well, bit by bit, we roll them over. I mean, don't give up on this notion that there's a natural time for a lot of this. The only question really is whether that rolling over process is going to be fast enough. I look at the approaches taken by most young elected politicians around the world today, and they're all absolutely get what this is about. There's no sense any longer that people of a different age are still opposed to changes of this kind. It really is a generational thing going on in that regard. And you need to hang on to that, because a lot of old farts in the system are on the I'm not saying that they're going to disappear immediately, but they're sounding more and more irrelevant and tired. Oh my God, yeah. Really? Is anyone ever going to vote for that kind of person again?
So I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit more cynical, and I think you just look to the US for evidence of this, where there are very many smart, sharp, educated, Ivy League global people. You could look to some senators behind the, during the January 6th Capitol uprising, who are trying to make hay out of that. They're really good looking, shiny people. And so the cynicism that comes in such a system is you have to look to the incentives. Why does somebody who obviously understands the science of climate change and whatnot, why would they take such a public position completely contrary to it? It's because they're bankrolled by certain industries and certain interests. And so in systems such as the US, there's such a big role of money in politics, and you really need to kind of dismantle that. In places like Kenya, I remember there was a massive coal plant that was planned in a country that, there was no need, we have no need for coal whatsoever. I mean, nobody does, but in Kenya especially. But, there was a kind of backroom deals, opportunities for corruption and kickbacks. And so there are reasons where smart people take the cynical position.
Wasn't that one case in that Kenyan coal plant that it did get stopped because people...
It did, by activists. Yeah,
exactly. So that's a success. For the people, right?
Yeah. So, but it's kind of like, one for the activists, but the cynical politicians and business interests, they're winning. They really are winning.
Dave, do you think they're winning?
I think for now, but I think you've got a really, really troublesome generation coming up. And I'm not even I'm talking about the younger ones who are going to come out, and we are going to kick politicians out if they don't work to what the people want. And I think that's really important. Like, even as you were saying with America, I do feel like there are a lot of people who are just recognizing a broken system, but going the wrong way, and going for Trump and not realizing he is part of the broken system. So it is very much like improving democracy, and not just improving, but radically changing it to the point of where it actually stays true to its core principles and values. And that's kind of where I stay with like trying to educate young people in understanding democracy, what they should have agency in, and also how they can enact change as well. And I don't think that should just be left for young people, but for all marginalized groups, because there are so many marginalized groups. If we actually band together, we could actually become the majority. And I think that's something that we need to recognize.
But perhaps not all marginalized groups want the same thing. I mean, part of the challenge of democracy is mediating conflicting interests.
I feel like with climate change, there is not so much but wanting to live, and I think that's something that we could all come together around. It's just wanting to live in a planet where you don't have to think about whether I should have a child or not, or you don't have to think about whether I'm breathing clean air, or whether the air that I'm breathing is literally killing me. That's something that I feel like a lot of people can rally behind, no matter what left or right or center your political opinion sways on. It's the right to life that we're talking about.
Right. So we talked a little bit about the question of language, and there is a question about whether climate change is too soft a term. And that ties into another question that I think is relevant in democracies, and it's the balance between messaging on fear, on emergency, it's, you know, the world is going to end, we're all going to die, and messaging on hope. There's a better world if we can build a cleaner, greener, you know, fairer world. How would you balance that? You know, you're all involved in this process. Which do you think is the most effective way to communicate and to mobilize and to change?
It's a bit of both, I think.
Yeah.
I think
It's
so.
a polar opposite. Yeah, it's a polar polarity.
I put it as love and rage, of like, you have love for like the positive things, the vision, the things that we were excited for. But then you have the rage of you're really angry and you want
hell. Yeah, actually, so Cristina Figueres, who ran the UNFCCC during the COP21 Paris process, she's a fantastic woman, but, you know, she would talk about having to kind of balance two messages at the same time. So when talking to governments and leaders, you have to, you know, panic them. You have to be like, the world is ending now, everything is, you know, going to hell, literally. But then you also have to give room for hope so they can feel like they can do something about it. It's just such a balancing act. But, you know, I think something that Days said made me really think about this idea of the climate emergency and what that Jonathon brought up, kind of changing language, and then tying back to what Isabel had said about action in a crisis. And, you know, one thing, our current climate diplomatic processes are built off in many ways of the ozone process, so the Montreal Protocol, and that was like this, you know, hole in the sky, there it is, we can see it, oh, you know, we're all going to get skin cancer. It was this kind of very well-defined emergency, you know. Yeah. And there's been a lot of talk that climate doesn't lend itself to that because it's nebulous and it's long-term. But, you know, when I hear Day say that the air I breathe, oh, should I have children? Like there are ways that you can cast this big problem that is nebulous. You can cast it, I think, I'm just learning on this call, in ways, when she said that, it made me think, oh, is the air I breathe clean? Or what should I do about children? But so I think that we could use language that makes it more real and personal to bridge that gap.
Cornelia, you're a person deeply involved with culture and how it changes thinking. Would you think hope or fear is the most effective mobilizer?
I think, yes, I think, you know, Days and Rose, I think they need to be both, you know, and I just got Jonathon's book, which is called Hope in Hell.
Very, very gloomy.
It's got hope in it. It's got hope. Perhaps we need something even more polarizing than that. But I do think people really have to realize it's a crisis. It's got to have something with an accelerant in it. You know, it needs something that's, you know, turbocharged in some kind of way. And I think we haven't got time. We haven't got time for it to be something that's more subtle, really. You know.
Yeah, no, I mean, Isabel, I hate to disagree with you, but the book is not very gloomy. The book is more...
I didn't mean the book, I meant
it's more about hope than it is about hell, because
well, that's great.
It is literally impossible to mobilize huge numbers of people of whatever age if all you've got to offer them is a journey towards hell. If that's it, no one's going to start doing the stuff that everybody on this call is doing. No one's going to energize themselves to do something. They're just going to find a way of forgetting their sorrows and the sorrows of the world until such time as that apocalyptic moment arrives. So you have to find ways of providing people with a sense of hopefulness about a better world. And there's no reason why that shouldn't work for people. There are so many good, hopeful things happening in the world today. And we've talked a lot about the emergence of young people in the climate movement as a whole. For God's sake, that's one of the most amazing things to have happened in 30 years of climate campaigning, is that from 2018 onwards, young people began to say, look, really, you're not on top of this, guys. You're going to have to do this a bit differently, and started to do it differently. And it'll come back. Yes, 2020 has been a nightmare, but it'll come back.
Come back.
Okay. Yeah, we all had time to think about it, haven't we?
There's a related question here. As long as democracy is so wedded to capitalism, do you think we can see real change? Who wants to pick that up?
Everyone's moving around the answer. What should I say?
Everyone's pointing at
Well,
the person next to them.
I think I can go for this one, but do I think that we can see real change? I do think we can see some change, but not the change that's radical that I want to see personally. I like capitalism. The reason why colonialism and environmental collapse has kind of started was because of capitalism. It's this need to always expand and take from the earth and from people. And we know capitalism does not work for everyone around the world in itself without taking into environmental factors either. So I do think that we need to start looking at other alternatives when it comes to looking at our economy and how we organize our systems. And I do think that although we can create some really amazing change, we should have that larger vision of saying, like, we don't have to kind of toe this line and stay in this box. We can break the box and create a new one that fits for everyone. And it is a possibility.
I mean, I read this great book recently called Dark Emu, which is all about Australia and about the Aborigines and about their agriculture and how they spread right across Australia. Most of Australia's desert now. It just I think they've got one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. It's incredible. And then the white people came and they basically took their land for their cattle. They enslaved the Aboriginals, and the land became fallow. Because the cows and pigs and all the rest of it they had on the sheep, they just basically made it into a desert. So now it's a desert. But if they could go back to where the Aboriginals were before the settlers came, perhaps that might be, I think it's the agriculture that's going to save us.
We could continue for a long time. I think we have made some progress. We haven't entirely given way to despair, and perhaps if we read Jonathon's book, we will be inspired by hope. We were waiting for the youth movement to return to the streets to shake the politicians up. So thank you, all of you, for watching, and a huge thank you to our panelists, Cornelia Parker, Rose Mutiso, Days Agaji, and Jonathon Porritt. I hope you all found that very stimulating. And if so, perhaps you'd like to check out the next session at 7 o'clock. There's a panel discussion with the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies to explore ice as a metaphor for the planet's uncertain and fragile future. And at 8:30, a discussion on how artificial intelligence and advanced technologies might shape the future. More information and tickets in the chat. Thank you all very much indeed from us now. Good night.